Picture this scene. It's the mid-1960s, and the biggest diplomatic crisis facing the Western world isn't nuclear proliferation or the Cold War. It's cheap frozen poultry.
Chicken. It's always something unexpected.
Exactly. American farmers are just flooding Europe with chicken, and Europe retaliates with a tax. Now, logically, you'd expect some counter-negotiation, right? Maybe some boring trade talks.
The normal channels.
The normal channels. Instead, President Lyndon B. Johnson, he takes it personally. He doesn't just want to fix trade, he wants revenge. So in a fit of what you can only really describe as petty executive rage, he doesn't tax European food back. He targets light trucks.
Light trucks, of all things.
He slaps a massive 25% tariff on them. And what's fascinating is looking at the fallout today, I mean, nearly 60 years later. Yeah. You walk into a dealership, you look at the sticker price of a Ford F-150, and you wonder why it costs a fortune.
It's not just inflation or tech. You are literally paying for a ghost of a dispute over chicken wings from 1964. That policy, the chicken tax, it never went away. It created this bizarre protected bubble where American automakers face almost no competition for trucks, and consumers just like, well, they pay the bill.
It seems like a funny historical footnote, you know, a temper tantrum that became law.
It does. But when you really look at it, this isn't an exception. It's the blueprint. It perfectly captures this distinct cyclical absurdity of how the United States handles trade. A mix of bruised ego, short-term anger, and then these policies that just stick around long after the original problem is forgotten.
And that right there is the essential conflict we are diving into today. We're contrasting this cyclical and I would say often self-destructive pattern of U.S. protectionism policies born of, well, political vanity with the highly strategic, adaptive, and long-term response we are seeing from China today.
We've compiled detailed economic modeling that quantifies the staggering costs of further U.S. tariff escalation, things like revoking China's permanent normalized trade relations status. And we have to be very clear about what we mean by that. We are modeling what happens when the U.S. abandons normal trade rules and applies these draconian Smoot-Hawley era punitive tariffs.
We hear phrases like economic shock scenarios thrown around a lot, but what's the biggest misconception people have about how quickly those shocks would materialize if the U.S. were to follow through on applying those highest non-PNTR tariff rates, what are often referred to as column 2 rates?
I think the misconception is that it's a slow bleed.
Right.
The modeling shows that the shock is almost instantaneous because global supply chains, they operate on confidence and cost predictability. So the second that shift happens, the price increase on intermediate inputs, the components U.S. businesses rely on, that happens the next day. But crucially, our sources also contain these compelling narratives and strategic analyses, illustrating how China is actively building resilience. They are executing internal strategies like the dual circulation model and strengthening external partnerships through massive blocks like RCEP. These strategies are specifically designed to minimize the pain of those American trade walls. It's the folly of the past versus the strategic resilience of the present.
And the data is very clear on who ultimately ends up paying the bill.
Exactly. It's American protectionism, and the bill comes due at home.
That history of folly is a perfect setup then. So let's start there. Okay, let's unpack this long history of trade policy based on really political motivation. The current conflict feels unprecedented to many people, but when you look at the archives, this protectionist impulse in the U.S. is it's deep-seated.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not new. It's a repeating cycle across generations, an economic pie-in-the-face routine repeated across 2.5 centuries.
It absolutely is. And what's truly remarkable is that the political rationale for tariffs has remained almost identical since the nation's founding, even as the global economy shifted completely. We can chart this recurring economic trauma through distinct historical stages, showing how a policy tool intended for revenue and protection became a source of constitutional crisis and even global disaster.
Let's start at the beginning then, the nurturing stage in 1789. This is where Alexander Hamilton laid the foundation.
Right. Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, he was fundamentally worried that America, freshly independent, would simply be an agrarian client state of industrial Britain. He believed America's fledgling industries, our infant industries as he called them, needed shielding from established British manufacturing power.
So tariffs were the tool.
Tariffs were the tool.
Yeah.
To finance the government, which is desperately broke, and to nurture these baby factories.
And it worked, I mean, for some regions.
It did. Manufacturing in the North, particularly New England, it prospered under this protection. But immediately, this planted the seed of a fundamental conflict that would eventually tear the nation apart.
How so?
Well, the industrial North favored high tariffs for protection against foreign goods. The agrarian South, however, they needed to import manufactured goods cheaply and export raw cotton freely. They viewed tariffs as a direct tax on their consumption and a penalty on their exports.
They called it legalized theft.
That's the term they used. The protectionist cycle was born wrapped in an immediate generations-long regional conflict.
So if 1789 was the seed of conflict, 1828 was the full-blown crisis, the famously named Tariff of Abominations. It sounds dramatic, but what made this particular tariff so combustible?
Well, any pretense of subtlety was just abandoned completely. This tariff slapped duties as high as 45% on imported goods. The South was already furious, but this act pushed them to the brink. And the crisis wasn't just economic, it became constitutional.
Right, this is where John C. Calhoun comes in.
John C. Calhoun, the political philosopher for the region and vice president at the time, he developed the doctrine of nullification. He threatened that South Carolina would unilaterally declare the federal tariff law void and just refuse to enforce it within its borders.
That's astounding. We're talking about the nation almost triggering armed conflict purely over the cost of goods, specifically British cloth, years before slavery really dominated the discourse.
Precisely. It was an existential crisis. Andrew Jackson, the sitting president, he famously threatened military action to enforce the federal law in what became known as the nullification crisis.
So it just goes to show how quickly this stuff can escalate.
It demonstrates how quickly economic policy mixed with regional pride and, political vanity can bring a republic to the brink. The stakes were immediate. The tariff wasn't just a tax. It was seen as a weapon wielded by one section of the country against another.
Okay, let's fast forward to 1861 and the Civil War. With the South gone, did the Northern view of tariffs just suddenly become national policy?
It did, and it provided a new context for tariffs, moving them from protection to pure financing. With the Southern states having seceded and no longer voting, the Morrill Tariff was passed. It raised duties significantly, up to 48%.
And this was to fund the war effort.
It provided essential financing for the Union war effort, a crucial war tax. But the war funding aspect also had a profound long-term side effect. It turbocharged Northern industry. They benefited immensely from these thick new tariff walls, effectively eliminating any British competition during that critical industrialization period.
And after the war, I'm guessing those high duties didn't just disappear.
No, they remained, establishing a long period of what's called gilded isolation in the 1890s.
Right.
Indeed, this was protectionism elevated to an art form, really, driven by powerful industrialists.
Oh, yeah.
We saw tariffs reach record highs. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 immediately made everything more expensive and resulted in the Republicans being annihilated in the midterms.
A clear signal that voters dislike paying more for household items.
Even if you frame it as patriotic. Yet, the pressure remained. And the Dingley Tariff of 1897 followed, raising duties even higher. This thrilled domestic monopolists who faced no foreign competition, guaranteeing high domestic prices, but it absolutely enraged U.S. exporters facing retaliation in foreign markets.
So they couldn't sell their goods abroad.
Not easily. By 1900, the U.S. had effectively declared economic independence, not just from Britain, but from the global competitive market altogether, wrapping itself in this protectionist cocoon.
All of this, however, it kind of pales in comparison to the sheer economic incompetence of 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff.
Right.
That is the policy that every economist today points to as the ultimate example of self-harm.
Smoot-Hawley stands as the quintessential cautionary tale, and it's critical because it shows the mechanism of global retaliation in full swing. It was enacted by politicians who believed that by strangling trade, they could save the domestic economy and protect American jobs.
And the impact.
Catastrophic, because the U.S. was, by 1930, a major global engine. It immediately triggered a global chain reaction of retaliatory tariffs from countries like Canada, France, and Britain, who responded to U.S. barriers by just slamming the door shut on American goods.
So American farmers and exporters were hit twice. Once by the general recession, and again by the global doors slamming shut in response to U.S. policy.
Exactly. This immediate reciprocal collapse of world trade by a massive two-thirds, combined with the financial crisis, converted what was a severe recession into the Great Depression. It is universally cited by economists as one of the worst policy decisions in modern history.
The names Smoot and Hawley are basically shorthand for economic disaster.
Forever associated with economic destruction by protectionist zeal.
And even after being thoroughly chastened by Smoot-Hawley and helping build a global trade order after World War II, The U.S. still couldn't resist falling back into old habits, albeit in a more, let's say, creative way in the 1980s with Japanese automakers.
This was the farce phase of protectionism, and it is eerily similar to the chicken tax scenario. Instead of imposing a direct tariff, which would violate GATT rules, the Reagan administration opted for voluntary export restraints, or VERs, against Japanese automakers who were rapidly outpacing Detroit.
The goal being to limit the number of cheap, fuel-efficient cars entering the U.S. market to give American companies time to catch up.
That was the idea.
But the ingenious Japanese companies just stand. They sidestepped the goal entirely, right?
They did. Japanese companies are strategic, not reactive. Facing constraints on exports, they made a strategic pivot. They built their factories in the United States, in states like Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. This meant that the protectionist goal was defeated by ingenuity and economic logic. The U.S. auto market was protected, yes, but U.S. workers were now employed manufacturing Hondas and Toyotas on American soil. The policy didn't save Detroit jobs. It simply redefined the nationality of the employer.
So when you look back at these 2.5 centuries of tariffs, the outcome is always the same cycle.
It is a cycle of predictable loss and inefficiency. Politicians get their applause lines, lobbyists win profits, but the true losers are always American consumers paying higher prices, American exporters facing closed foreign markets, and the U.S. economy as a whole, which sacrifices efficiency and growth potential.
The country repeatedly confuses taxing foreign goods with genuine patriotism.
And the short-term political win becomes a long-term economic drain. It's this constant repetition of the protectionist trap that brings us to the current moment.
Okay, so now let's transition from history to the present, because the current threat of escalation is built upon this long history, but the potential economic cost is, it's far more quantifiable today.
It is. We have sophisticated economic modeling detailing the profound economic self-harm that would result from further tariff escalation, specifically modeling the worst-case scenario, revoking China's permanent normalized trade relations status and applying high Column 2 tariff rates.
Let's just clarify that technical jargon immediately for the listener. What does it mean when we say revoking PNTR status and applying Column 2 rates?
That's crucial. PNTR stands for Permanent Normalized Trade Relations. Since China joined the WTO in 2001, it has had PNTR status with the U.S., meaning the tariffs applied to Chinese goods are the same low tariffs applied to almost all other major U.S. trading partners.
And normal rates.
The normal rates. Revoking PNTR means moving China to Column 2 of the U.S. tariff schedule, which contains the high rates originally set by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. These punitive tariffs, which can range from 30% to over 100%, are currently only applied to countries like Cuba and North Korea.
So we're modeling the economic impact of the U.S. voluntarily moving its trade relationship with the world's second largest economy, from normal trading rules to a relationship typically reserved for, hostile pariah states.
That is the scenario. And before diving into the catastrophic future, let's remember the damage that already exists from the more limited 2018-2023 trade actions. We already paid a significant price just for those initial steps.
Right. This isn't starting from zero.
Not at all. The initial trade war period of 2018-2019 alone resulted in quantified losses of $121 billion in U.S. output and a net loss of 245,000 American jobs. Moreover, the commercial relationship has deteriorated. U.S. exports to China fell 18% between 2017 and 2019, and the share of U.S. exports going to China dropped noticeably. Decoupling is already expensive and underway.
Okay, so if the U.S. decides to double down on this protectionist impulse by moving away from PNTR and applying Column 2 rates, what does the model show? Let's focus on Scenario 1. Unilateral U.S. escalation. This is the U.S. raising tariffs on Chinese goods from the current average of about 19% to roughly 61%, assuming China does not immediately retaliate.
The massive economic shock begins immediately in 2024. The first and most immediate effect is an inflationary shock.
Of course.
Because Chinese goods make up such a substantial share of U.S. industry's inputs, everything from microchips to steel components and consumer goods, higher import prices translate directly into higher prices domestically. We estimate that consumer prices would rise 1.2% above baseline almost instantly, potentially pushing CPI inflation up to about 4% in that first year.
That immediately hits the American consumer's wallet, but the greater damage must come from the industrial side.
Okay, it does. Even worse for American industry, producer prices, the cost for U.S. businesses to acquire the necessary intermediate inputs would rise 3.5% above baseline, resulting in 5% PPI inflation in 2024.
Yeah.
That input cost shock for producers, where costs rise by roughly 4%, immediately cripples U.S. competitiveness compared to global peers who are not facing these tariff increases. In the short term, businesses have to absorb those higher prices or pass them on, leading to an erosion of margins and reduced competitiveness globally.
I understand the price hike, but why does that translate into such devastating job losses?
Okay.
Where do we hit the peak economic losses? Protectionism is so often pitched as a job-saving measure, but the data consistently shows the reverse.
The modeling reveals that the economy hits the trough of disruption in 2025. This is where the price increases, reduced business confidence, and the subsequent drop in domestic and international demand all converge. The data shows three key impacts. First, rising costs and inflation cause real household income to drop, meaning U.S. consumption falls by a massive $420 billion, which is a 1.6% drop relative to the baseline. Households' disposable income drops by an estimated 1.4%.
And second,
private business investment falls by a dramatic 4.1%.
wait, I need to stop you there. Why does private business investment fall exactly 4.1%? Are businesses purely reacting to the cost shock, or is this primarily a confidence issue?
It's a combination, but confidence and uncertainty play a massive role. When a government implements such a dramatic, hostile policy shift like revoking PNTR, it signals profound economic instability.
Right, nobody knows what's coming next.
Exactly. So companies facing uncertainty and higher costs for intermediate inputs, and knowing that their export markets could be hit by retaliation, they slash investment plans for expansion, new technology, and facilities. It's a risk aversion measure against unpredictable policy.
Okay, so that's consumption and investment. What's the third impact?
And third, the convergence of reduced consumption, falling investment, and higher input costs leads to the employment hit. We see a peak loss of 744,000 net American jobs by 2025 compared to the baseline forecast. It is an overwhelming net loss driven by declining real income and weaker domestic and international demand.
It just demonstrates that the policy is a job destroyer, not a job saver.
It is. And a cumulative loss over the medium term must look staggering as well, representing a massive opportunity cost for the country.
What are we talking about there?
Over the 5-year period from 2024 to 2028, the cumulative GDP loss to the U.S. economy would be a staggering $1.6 trillion. But the damage doesn't vanish once the peak crisis subsides. Trade barriers fundamentally short-circuit the competitive process that drives efficiency, leaving a permanent scar on the U.S. economy.
What does that long-term structural damage look like by 2028?
Well, by 2028, even after some market adjustment, U.S. output would still permanently remain 1.2% lower than it would have been without the tariffs, resulting in 254,000 fewer jobs on a net basis. Furthermore, U.S. households would lose an estimated $1,900 in average annual income every single year going forward.
Every year?
Every year, due to reduced competition, less efficiency, and permanently higher prices for goods. The policy essentially guarantees a long-term reduction in the U.S. economy's growth potential.
Let's break down that pain. Where is this job destruction and output loss localized? I would have instinctively thought the pain would be isolated to the manufacturing floors, but the state-level data suggests a broader impact.
The impact is indeed broad-based. The models highlight the deep suffering in the manufacturing heartland sectors like motor vehicles, transport equipment, and machinery suffer the worst output declines, up to 4.4% in some scenarios.
And why is that?
Because they have a high reliance on Chinese intermediate inputs, and their suddenly rising costs cannot be easily offset or sourced elsewhere quickly. This makes the finished U.S. goods more expensive and less competitive globally.
So the very industries being protected become less efficient and competitive.
Precisely. They are penalized by their own government's policy. But the second major casualty group is the domestic consumer-facing industries. Consumer services sectors like health, construction, retail, trade, and arts entertainment, they face a broad decline simply because of lower household incomes and reduced consumer spending.
Right, when people are paying more for tariffs and facing economic uncertainty, they stop going out, they delay renovations, they cut discretionary spending.
That's it, exactly.
Wait, okay, but why are states like Nevada and Florida hit proportionally worse than states with massive manufacturing bases like Michigan or Ohio? That seems counterintuitive.
That's the paradox of protectionism. The deepest proportional GDP hits are in consumer-dependent states like Nevada, Arizona, and Florida, all projected to be down 1.6% to 1.7% relative to the baseline.
So Nevada takes the biggest hit.
Nevada, with its massive reliance on tourism and consumer services, suffers the largest overall proportional decline because its economy is highly sensitive to reduced national discretionary spending. Florida, similarly, relies on construction, retirement, and tourism, all of which are hit hard by lower household wealth and investment.
So while manufacturing-heavy states lose jobs in specific industrial plants, service-oriented states experience a broad, immediate economic slowdown across every sector that depends on domestic spending.
You've got it. Even California, due to its sheer size and exposure in various sectors, is projected to lose 96,000 jobs by 2025. The data confirms the U.S. harms its own businesses and domestic economy most acutely.
So we've established the self-destructive pattern of U.S. policy. Now, let's pivot to China's response, because they haven't simply waited for the next policy blow. They've formulated a grand, long-term economic strategy designed specifically to insulate themselves from U.S. policy shocks, the dual circulation strategy.
That's the key difference we keep seeing. Strategy versus reaction. Dual circulation is China's proactive method for building resilience. Introduced in May 2020 at a time of rising external volatility and trade war intensity, its core purpose is to reorganize the national economy so that it is less vulnerable to global turbulence or external pressures, like those exerted by the U.S. It's an internal stabilization effort.
What exactly is the core concept of dual circulation? Sounds complex, but it really boils down to balancing internal and external drivers, doesn't it?
It does. The strategy is centered on making the domestic circulation, meaning the entire cycle of production, distribution, and consumption within China, the primary engine of growth. The goal is achieving more robust, sustainable development, reducing reliance on external export-led growth, which is susceptible to volatile international demand and unpredictable U.S. trade policy.
And crucially, the sources emphasize that this is not an isolationist policy, which is often how it's misinterpreted in the West. It's about building a core engine that can withstand external turbulence.
That is a critical distinction. The policy is emphatically not isolationist. China maintains its commitment to opening up to the international circulation of goods and investment. But it's a necessary strategic pivot.
So it's about balance.
It's unlocking the vast potential of domestic demand to successfully link the domestic and international markets, maximizing the use of both markets and both domestic and foreign resources. The idea is that if the domestic engine is strong enough, external volatility can be weathered without derailing the entire growth trajectory.
If the domestic circulation is the main element, how is that reinforced? What are the two pillars holding up this strategic framework?
The strategy rests on two main pillars designed to strengthen that domestic engine. The first pillar is expanding consumption-led domestic demand. Historically, China relied heavily on exports and infrastructure investment. But with an aging population and increasing geopolitical friction, consumption has to become the stabilizer.
Right, getting its massive population to buy more.
Exactly. China needs its massive population, nearly a fifth of the world, to consume more of the higher quality, higher value goods it is already producing.
And the second pillar?
The second pillar is executing deep supply side reforms. This involves improving productivity across all sectors and, critically, promoting industrial upgrading through relentless innovation. This means moving away from the low-cost, low-value assembly, where they were merely the world's factory, and mastering the higher-value components of the supply chain.
Things like advanced industrial machinery and high-tech components.
Precisely.
That shift away from the world's factory model is fascinating. We saw that traditional model relying heavily on low-margin processing trade due to low labor costs, but that has run its course. Dual circulation is designed to help them climb that value chain, correct?
Exactly. Economists often talk about the smiling curve of value creation in supply chains. The lowest margins are in the assembly or processing stage, the bottom of the smile.
And the highest margins?
The highest margins are at R&D, design, brand management, and distribution, the two ends of the smile. By focusing on industrial upgrading through innovation, China aims to climb that curve, capturing higher margins and making their domestic supply chain inherently more valuable and less dependent on external assembly contracts. This is a profound long-term shift.
Now, for a strategy this massive to succeed, it must face significant internal headwinds. What are the key challenges to internal demand that must be overcome for dual circulation to really take root?
There are three deeply structural hurdles that the strategy must successfully navigate, and they are not quick fixes. First, there's wide income inequality between urban and rural areas.
A huge gap.
A huge gap. Data shows a clear relationship. The ratio of private consumption to GDP tends to synchronize with the ratio of rural area income to urban area income per capita. For the strategy to truly unleash consumption nationally, this massive disparity must be corrected. You cannot have a consumption-led economy if a massive portion of your population lacks the disposable income to participate robustly.
And the second major structural problem is the lack of a sufficient social safety net.
Correct. The underdevelopment of social security systems acts as a major brake on consumption. When people lack robust, guaranteed social safety nets, secure health care, adequate pensions, or strong unemployment insurance, they tend to save a much higher percentage of their income for unforeseen circumstances.
The rainy day fund.
This precautionary saving behavior, while rational for the individual, depresses national current consumption, running counter to the goals of dual circulation.
And the third hurdle sounds familiar to anyone living in a major Western city: housing debt.
Precisely. The heavy burden of debt repayment on households, driven particularly by rapidly rising housing prices over the last 2 decades, holds down spending. When a large and increasing portion of household income is channeled toward mortgage payments, there is less left over for general consumption and discretionary spending.
So the success of dual circulation really hinges on correcting these 3 deeply structural economic realities to unleash that vast potential domestic market and create a stable core.
That's the challenge ahead.
So dual circulation is the internal defense mechanism. Externally, China's strategy is not isolation, but multilateral engagement offering stability and predictability in stark contrast to the historical chaos of the U.S. approach. And the cornerstone of this external strategy is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP.
This is where the strategic contrast really crystallizes. While U.S. policy often relies on unilateral actions, sudden shocks, and punitive tariffs, China has chosen to promote a stable, predictable, rules-based framework across its immediate region, providing a sense of certainty to its partners.
And we have an anecdote that perfectly illustrates this difference.
Yeah, the perspective of a logistics coordinator on the ground in Shanghai.
Let's look at the operational reality of this stability.
This logistics coordinator we analyzed described her experience managing U.S. shipments during the height of the U.S. tariff escalations as managing chaos and high stress. She had to check news feeds every morning, fearful that a single sudden policy tweet from the U.S. would change the tariff rate, render cargo stuck in port, or cancel contracts entirely.
That's incredible.
She spoke of American clients constantly canceling at the last minute because they simply couldn't calculate the final landed cost of the goods due to unpredictable tariffs. The unpredictability was, she stressed, the greatest source of risk and cost.
That fear of policy shock must be incredibly disruptive for long-term supply chain planning. Now contrast that stress with shipments moving under multilateral agreements like RCEP.
She described RCEP processes as boring.
Which in logistics is a good thing.
In logistics, boring means safe and predictable. She recounted a specific week where a complex shipment of auto parts to an RCEP partner nation cleared customs in a matter of hours because the stable, low-barrier, rules-based framework was in place.
Meanwhile,
a U.S. shipment of steel screws was stalled for days by a sudden reclassification under the existing trade war tariffs, a bureaucratic nightmare of risk and uncertainty. The key takeaway was that, for those actually moving goods, the U.S. market was viewed as high risk, high stress, while the multilateral partnerships felt like the adults in the room.
That humanizes the policy choice. If you're a business, you gravitate towards stability. Now let's dive into the core of the RCEP agreement itself. What does it look like?
The RCEP is an enormous transformative agreement. It was signed in November 2020 and became effective in January 2022. It is the largest trade bloc in history. 15 Asia-Pacific countries, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all 10 ASEAN member nations.
That's a huge portion of the global economy.
Together, these countries represent about 30% of global GDP and 30% of the world's population.
That scale gives it incredible geopolitical and economic gravity. What are the key elements contained within the agreement that make it so powerful?
Well, the agreement aims to eliminate about 90% of tariffs among the signatories within 20 years. But beyond tariff reduction, the key structural feature is the introduction of unified rules of origin.
Why is that so important?
This is critical because it greatly simplifies complex international supply chains operating within the region. Instead of meeting different requirements for every bilateral deal, one set of rules applies across the entire bloc, facilitating deeper trade integration and making regional sourcing much easier.
And from a geopolitical win perspective, this agreement clearly benefited from the U.S., withdrawing from the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP.
Absolutely. The geopolitical timing was perfect for China. Analysts universally projected that RCEP would pull the economic center of gravity back towards Asia. With the U.S. absent from regional agreements after withdrawing from the proposed TPP, RCEP positioned China to take the lead in writing the trade rules for the region.
It provided an alternative.
The sheer size and stability of RCEP provided an immediate, reliable alternative to the trade volatility coming from the West.
And the projected economic value backs this up. This is a significant economic shield.
It is projected to add over $209 billion annually to world incomes by 2030. Furthermore, simulations showed that RCEP would be especially valuable for its members because it strengthens East Asian interdependence, increasing trade among members by $428 billion.
So it's a deliberate strategic shield.
The Asian Development Bank specifically noted that RCEP would assist in mitigating the effects of the U.S.-China trade war on East Asia. It is a deliberate strategic shield built against American protectionism, confirming to regional partners that stability lies within the bloc.
This stability then feeds directly into how supply chains operate. Let's look at a concrete example of this trade diversification in action, through the eyes of a factory owner who realized the world had gotten bigger.
This brings us to Mr. Chen, a mid-size electronics manufacturer in Dongguan. For 2 decades, his business orbited the U.S. market, selling components almost exclusively to American buyers. He described the initial intensification of the trade war as watching your oxygen supply slowly get cut off.
I can imagine.
Facing 25% tariffs on his components, panic set in. He thought his business was unsustainable if he couldn't access his primary market.
But the walls built in Washington inadvertently pointed him toward the infrastructure being built elsewhere, specifically the pathways created by the Belt and Road Initiative.
That's the profound irony. He realized that while the U.S. was erecting tariffs, global infrastructure was changing. The Belt and Road Initiative, which had been criticized in the West, had been quietly paving physical and economic pathways to new markets in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Africa.
So you switched focus.
Mr. Chen recounted switching his focus almost entirely, moving from targeting Los Angeles to targeting places like Jakarta and Nairobi. He discovered that the rapidly emerging middle class in Southeast Asia and the rising demand for affordable technology in Africa represented massive, untapped reservoirs of demand that were less sensitive to Western political risk.
And by 2023, his business was thriving again, just directed elsewhere. The U.S. tariffs achieved the opposite of isolation.
Yes. His conclusion was that the tariffs forced him to realize that the world is much bigger than just one country. He stopped looking exclusively west and started looking everywhere, leveraging the new stable trade pathways and agreements.
So this story really confirms the model.
It does. The U.S. tariffs were designed to isolate China, but for resilient entrepreneurs like Mr. Chen, they merely acted as a harsh but effective wake-up call to diversify. The protectionist actions did not stop trade. They forced that trade to flow into new, non-U.S. dependent riverbeds, making China more resilient to American policy over the long term.
The third great irony in the story of U.S. trade policy is found in the high-tech sector. The measures taken by the U.S. were specifically aimed at slowing China's technological advancement by cutting off access to superior American components, particularly semiconductors.
And the result, again, appears to be the opposite of the intended goal.
This brings us to the story of an industrial drone startup in Shenzhen that was essentially given a death sentence by U.S. technology tariffs, only to find new life and independence.
That's right. This was a startup developing advanced industrial drones used for everything from surveying to agriculture. Their original business model was efficient, but strategically fragile. They acted as systems integrators, purchasing the best chips and processors from American suppliers, assembling the rest, and focusing their innovation entirely on software and application layers.
So when the entity lists and high-tech tariffs hit,
their core American processor supply was mandated to be cut off overnight.
Their entire business model collapsed because they were dependent on one component source, even if it was the best one.
The lead engineer described the mandated cutoff as a funeral for their company. They feared they were dead because their entire competitive advantage rested on guaranteed access to American technological superiority and components. Their dependency was nearly fatal.
But instead of failing, they were forced into a desperate, accelerated act of technological creation.
Exactly. They had no other option but self-sufficiency. The team was forced to redesign their drone architecture completely, switching immediately to domestic chips, which were, at the time, recognized as inferior, slower, less power efficient, and physically bulkier.
So what did they do?
They spent the next year and a half compensating for the inherent hardware limitations by writing better, more efficient, and more sophisticated control software and optimized code. They mastered the entire system because they had to make the inferior domestic components perform better than they should have.
And the long-term stinging irony of this crisis-driven innovation.
The irony is powerful. They didn't just survive. They ultimately exceeded their old performance benchmarks because they were forced to master the entire technology stack from the silicon up. They understood the hardware limitations so intimately that they wrote software perfectly tailored to those chips.
Oh.
The lead engineer reflected that if the U.S. hadn't cut us off, we would have been lazy forever. We would have relied on American chips indefinitely. Now we own our core technology and our destiny.
So the U.S. policy intended to starve the firm and maintain technological dependency. Instead, destroyed the crutch, accelerated self-sufficiency, and pushed China to become a global leader in advanced manufacturing in that specific niche.
It is the ultimate expression of the historical warning that tariffs and bans hurt the imposer in the long run. By trying to maintain market dominance through cutting off supply, the U.S. inadvertently guaranteed that its competitor would develop true technological independence, the exact opposite of the intended goal.
This acceleration towards self-sufficiency in critical sectors is a direct, negative, and permanent feedback loop resulting from the protectionist stance.
That's it.
We started by looking at the staggering $1.6 trillion in losses and the 744,000 net job losses if the U.S. acts unilaterally. Now let's bring this full circle and look at the most likely outcome of such an aggressive policy, the Chinese retaliation scenario.
Right.
This models the cumulative economic damage when the U.S. raises tariffs to column 2 levels, and China hits back by raising tariffs on U.S. exports to their own pre-WTO rates.
This full retaliation scenario is critical because, based on the principle of reciprocity that governs global trade, retaliation is highly likely and has already occurred in previous skirmishes. We assume China would lift all existing retaliatory tariff exclusions and raise tariffs on U.S. goods from their current average of 21% up to roughly 38%.
And that severely constrains market access for American companies that export to China.
Severely.
We already saw $1.6 trillion in losses. Where does the new incremental damage, the additional $300 billion in losses, bringing the total to $1.9 trillion, specifically come from?
That incremental loss is driven by two main factors: the sudden loss of market access for U.S. exporters and the compounding effect on domestic confidence and investment. The aggregated cost of this conflict surges significantly. The cumulative real GDP loss for the U.S. economy over the 5 years, 2024 to 2028, rises to $1.9 trillion. This additional $300 billion is the cost of closing the door on American exports.
And the peak employment hit worsens as well.
Yes. The peak net job losses in the U.S. rise to 801,000 jobs by 2025, an additional 57,000 jobs destroyed compared to the unilateral scenario. The long-run damage is also more severe. The permanent drop in U.S. GDP widens to 1.4% compared to 1.2% without retaliation, showing that the escalating conflict generates greater long-term harm through reduced efficiency and innovation.
What about the pain felt directly by American households when we look at the full retaliation scenario? That's where the cost becomes highly personal.
This is where the cost becomes acutely personal and highly political. The cumulative loss in household income over that 5-year period reaches an estimated $11,100 per household in today's prices.
$11,000.
This massive reduction in disposable income, driven by price increases, the negative wealth effects from shaky financial markets, and higher unemployment, further compresses consumer spending, creating a vicious cycle of deflationary pressure coexisting with tariff-induced inflation.
We noted earlier that agriculture was less affected in the unilateral scenario, but China is a huge strategic buyer of U.S. crops. How does Chinese retaliation impact U.S. agriculture?
China's retaliation is often explicitly designed to hit sensitive U.S. export sectors located in politically important states. Agricultural exports to China are estimated to fall by a massive 32% in this full retaliation scenario.
32%.
This compounds the economic damage in U.S. heartland states that rely heavily on exports of grains and soybeans, adding significant additional losses to states like Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. This is a targeted and very painful consequence of the U.S. escalating the trade war.
Let's look at the profound implications for trade reorientation. How drastically does the U.S.-China relationship change under this high tariff structure?
The trade relationship drastically reorients almost immediately. U.S. imports from China are projected to fall by a massive 86%. The U.S. shifts to importing more from Southeast Asia and the rest of the world, reflecting a permanent change in global supply chain flows away from China.
And U.S. exports are forced to find new, potentially less lucrative destinations.
Exactly. On the export side, the U.S. effectively loses reliable access to the lucrative Asian market, where China would be diverting its own trade toward RCEP partners. U.S. exports are forced to find new destinations, selling more to neighboring NAFTA countries and the EU.
So the overall outcome is that both the U.S. and China become more domestically oriented economies.
They do. This is reflected in the falling trade to GDP ratio for both nations compared to the 2028 baseline. And the overall outcome is that reduced trade openness diminishes the critical network effects of knowledge and technology spillovers that fuel long-term productivity and growth globally. Both countries, in attempting to decouple, guarantee a lower growth trajectory for themselves and the world.
So when we synthesize the findings of this deep dive, we see two fundamentally conflicting models of trade policy.
We do. The data is clear. The United States, by pursuing its historical, cyclical policy of protectionism based on short-term political motivation, imposes severe, predictable, and lasting costs on its own jobs, consumers, and long-term economic efficiency. The cumulative cost in the full retaliation scenario is projected to be nearly $2 trillion in lost US GDP and over 800,000 net job losses at peak.
Conversely, China's response has been marked by strategy, adaptation, and resilience. They did not merely absorb the economic blows, they pivoted immediately. Internally, they built the dual circulation model to harness their massive domestic demand and upgrade their industry through innovation.
And externally, they established RCEP, providing stability, predictability, and low barriers to partners, positioning themselves as the leader in Asia's economic future.
And perhaps the greatest, most powerful irony lies in the high-tech sector.
Were the U.S. policy, aimed at preventing China's technological advancement by cutting off component supply, inadvertently destroyed the crutch of foreign dependency. By forcing capable Chinese firms to innovate and master their entire technology stack from the Silicon up, the tariffs accelerated the drive toward technological self-sufficiency, the exact outcome the U.S. sought to prevent.
So the next time you look at the sticker price on that truck, you aren't just paying for steel and rubber. You are footing the bill for a 6-year-old political decision based on executive anger over frozen chicken. And if U.S. trade policy continues on this trajectory of escalation, the data shows we are simply choosing to pay a much, much higher bill in lost jobs, lower growth, and reduced household income.
The ultimate choice, as revealed by the data, is between pursuing policies based on short-term political vanity and paying the long-term economic drain, versus adopting strategies that build diversified, resilient, and stable trade relationships for the future.